the big story this week is the announcement that Keir Starmer has committed to raising defence spending. He's promised it will reach 2.5% of GDP by 2027. That's much earlier than thought, and 3% in the next Parliament. The overseas aid budget is going to be slashed to help pay for it. Let's dive straight in. Andrew, you've written for the New Statesman magazine this week that this will be a week remembered in history. Quite some claim. Why is it such an important crossroads?
We, like the rest of Europe, are facing a really, really dangerous period when it looks like Trump is going to impose an unequal and, I think, probably disastrous peace on Ukraine to end that war, when Putin will feel emboldened, and when everybody has woken up to the fact that right across Western Europe we are poorly defended, and frankly the military in Britain is grotesquely underfunded, hollowed out, as has been said many times before. We don't have the army in the numbers to send to help as defenders or peacekeepers of Ukraine in the future. We couldn't fight a proper war for more than a few days. We don't have a missile defense. We don't have proper defense of the undersea cables upon which our economy depends. All of those things have been true for a long time. If you look at the graph of spending, it has been going down and down and down as a proportion of GDP. Now, we're going to come on to the numbers, and I accept that percentage of GDP is a really bizarre way to measure anything these days. But nonetheless, you don't need the numbers. You just need to look at the size of the army. You need to look at the stockpiles of missiles and the aging rifles that our troops use and the rest of it to realize that we are very, very badly undefended. Now, if we are going to have a respectful relationship of any kind, not just with the Trump administration, but perhaps with the J.D. Vance administration, which might succeed that. So looking forward for a time. And if we are going to be taken seriously across Europe and provide the kind of leadership role that we could, we desperately need a better military, a better funded armed forces. And for the first time this week, we've got a Labour government saying we're going to do it. We're going to go back to the tradition of Attlee and Bevan after the war, and we're going to rebuild the British armed forces. Now, if they mean it, I think that is a really, really important moment.
All right, well, let's go into those numbers, Will, because there's been some sparring, hasn't there, about how much this actually equates to. We've got this figure of 13.4 billion, which the government's very keen to talk about. That's how much extra is going to be spent. And then there's this other figure of 6 billion. So talk us through this. Is it really a significant?
So, yes. So a maths crime has been committed. So let's Columbo it. So we really are going to spend 13 point something billion more relative to how much we are spending this year. And we're going to pay for it by cutting about 6 billion from aid, which seems like a bit of a magic trick. And it's not the first time that a government has done this magic trick. So last year, when the Tories were in government, they said we're going to spend an extra £75 billion on defence, and we're going to pay for it by sacking a load of civil servants. Obviously, they never did. And these were the kind of promises they could make because they knew they weren't going to win the election. But the way that they came up with that number by saying, oh, we're going to sack some civil servants and save about 4 point something billion a year and somehow get 75 billion, was they pretended that defence spending would otherwise, in the counterfactual world that the extra 75 billion is more than, was a world in which we didn't spend any more in defence, which is obviously not the real world, especially, when sorry to jump in. It's the difference between measuring where we are now and where we'll be then versus measuring what we would have been spending then and what we will now be spending then. Yeah, so it's the difference between the 75 billion and the 13 billion that Keir Starmer's talked about is the difference between if you just had flat cash on defence from now up until the point where you're going to be spending that 2.5% of GDP. So, but obviously, in a world in which Russia has invaded mainland Europe, then you are not going to be spending flat cash on defence. That was never going to happen. So really, the difference between what we are going to be spending and what we would actually have been spending is about 6 billion, and we are going to pay for that by cutting from aid. Now, that wouldn't really matter that Keir Starmer had kind of fudged those numbers if John Healey had not stood up when the Conservatives announced their spending plan and called it a fake figure and said, you're just making this up. Why are you making up this imaginary frozen baseline? And then Labour had done a smaller and more plausible version of the same trick. But yeah, we are going to be spending a lot more on it. That is achievable through the aid cuts, but they've also talked about raising defence spending to a further 3% of GDP in the next parliament, which will be a lot more expensive again. So that will probably cost about another 10 billion per year. And the per year is important because when it's a recurring cost every year, you can't borrow to do that. For some one-off cost things, you can borrow as a government, but if you have a cost that's happening every year, you can't tell the bond markets, we're going to borrow for that, because then you put your debt on an unsustainable path, and then you get into Liz Truss territory.
So you put up taxes or you cut services.
Yeah, so it's something like. And I mean, I don't think anyone thinks that you can really cut services much more than the cuts they're already facing. So you're looking at something like 1% on income tax, or a further extension of the kind of stealth taxes that we've already seen. The thresholds,
which will happen quite clearly.
Yeah,
I mean, Andrew, Rachel was saying on the podcast last week that benefits might have to be cut, would be the first thing that would be slashed to pay for any increase in defence spending. Instead, we've seen it come from overseas aid. Seemingly, the kind of head of that department, Annalisa Dodds, didn't really know anything about it.
She is the latest female cabinet minister to have briefing against her, and people saying she's going to have to resign or be pushed quite soon. This can't go on. Slightly worrying, the number of women at the top of government: Bridget Phillips and Annalisa Dodds, Lisa Nandy, who've been on the receiving end, Rachel Reeves herself. Now, it may just be coincidence of the kind of jobs they're doing and the way they've done them, but nonetheless, it's being noticed around Westminster. I think the politics of this, however, are bigger than that and really, really interesting. Keir Starmer has had this image, not just in the sort of Tory part of the country, but I think around the country, as a kind of liberal, humanitarian, civil rights lawyer living in this kind of internationalist, pro-aid milieu in North London. And that's because that's all been entirely accurate. And I think this is a really decisive moment in the change of the tone and the meaning of this government, in a sense. Keir Starmer slicing himself off quite deliberately from his friends, the people he's been moving around, the aid community, who are really outraged, really angry about this, and saying, no, I'm a different kind of prime minister. So if there was a sort of Morgan McSweeney manoeuvre to kind of blue Labourize this Labour government, this is an absolutely decisive moment, and it will never feel the same in terms of tone and meaning as it did before this week.
And you could tell that it was not a move that he really wanted to make. He said,
He hates it, I'm sure, personally. And I'm sure he's been phoned up and lobbied by lots of old personal friends saying, Keir, I can't believe you've done this. It's outrageous. And there's a certain amount of rowing back going on today about, we're going to ensure that we do this gently. We don't just suddenly pull out like US aid is suddenly pulling out. We're going to be, we're going to be Labour, we're going to be thoughtful. Nonetheless, it's a brutal, brutal thing to do. And, governments always talk about this as a very hard, very difficult choice. Well, it's a hard and difficult choice mainly for the poorest people in the world, not for British politicians. In terms of British politicians, you could argue it's an easy choice because it's the kind of choice, frankly, the public applauds. The public are quite in favour of cutting aid, overseas aid. They don't like it. And, of course, reform. Labour getting more and more worried about reform, and the Tories too would have done something quite similar. They can't really attack it. Where Keir Starmer is now more vulnerable than ever before, I think, is to the liberal democratic, again, internationalist, herbivorous, gentle, sort of vegetarian, forest-dwelling part of the nation, who will be very, very upset about this.
Well, we're talking about the absolutely staggering sums that are going to be needed going forward, particularly if that 3% is to be met. Is there a world in which some of that money, at least, could be found by making parts of the military more efficient, particularly procurement?
Yeah, so defence spending is a bit weird in that normally, as a government, when you talk about spending some money, you talk about the output first. You say we're going to build a bridge or, we're going to build a new railway, and then you get to the input, like how much it's going to cost. and you do it that way around. This is a plan to just spend a whole pile of money, and we're not sure exactly what it's going to be spent on. And with defence spending, also, you're never entirely sure what it's going to be spent on because defence spending is necessarily opaque. You can't do a really detailed contract that you publish for all the world to see when you're buying 1,000 missiles, because then you're telling the enemy that you have 1,000 missiles now, and you can't tell the public who is spending that money, because then the enemy's spies might want to get in touch with them, and there's all kinds of reasons why you have to be very, very careful about who you tell about your defence spending. But that also makes it very, very difficult to have oversight of and to criticise. And the defence industry is very, very good at lobbying. Everybody who works in Westminster sees a massive BAE Systems poster every single day as they come out of Westminster Station. If you look at the data on who has the most meetings in Westminster with ministers, the two biggest private companies over the last 10 years for frequency of meetings are BAE Systems and Airbus. They're very, very good at lobbying. The revolving door between the defence industry and government spins at an alarming rate. There are a lot of ways in which defence spending is there's a lot of kind of access going on, and it's very, very expensive stuff to buy, right? So accordingly, the MOD equipment plan at last count is now 16.9 billion over budget. So, it's tricky spending to do.
Just really interesting, and a few thoughts on that. One, it was interesting. Part of the statement from Keir Starmer in the Commons was to say that we know there's a problem with procurement, and we're going to have this kind of new oversight jointly between the Treasury and the MOD. In other words, we're taking away from the MOD its total power over this. Now, whether that works or not, who knows? Point one. Point two, if you look at what's been happening in Ukraine, lots and lots of very, very fast-moving defence development by, frankly, kids in garages and small companies. So, if the UK, the MOD is having a new attack drone, it'll take years and years and years, and big companies and lots of executives coming in and out of Whitehall, and lots of former members of the Ministry of Defence being given lucrative jobs in the relevant companies, and blah, blah, blah. The money goes on. Everything that Will has been describing. And you will get an okay drone at the end of the day, probably perhaps rather expensive and over budget. Whereas in Ukraine, they're doing it much better, very, very fast, in real time, for a fraction of the price. Now, one of the things that has to happen is we have to learn that lesson somehow and procure stuff in a different way. Final very quick point. It's not all about equipment. We don't have enough troops. We don't have enough medics to support the troops. We don't have enough drivers and logistics and pilots to support the troops. So one of the things that has to happen is an increase in the number of soldiers, which is fairly straightforward, and probably a big increase in kind of national service behind that. Starmer did talk about the entire country, British companies, British universities, and the British public all being involved in this. It's got very, very little coverage so far, but watch this space.
That could be an absolutely enormous change in society, couldn't it?
And I think, to go back to Andrew's point about, sort of the wider point of this being something that we are doing, perhaps entirely separately from America, but America's role being very, very different. A lot of our defense spending and defense development in the past has been done with American companies and with the American government. If you're not doing that anymore, it's going to be a lot more expensive and a lot more difficult.
It's going to be more expensive, but also there is the danger that if you get a sort of Trump administration or Vance administration who don't like what we're doing, they start to make it more expensive and more difficult for us to procure the stuff we have depended upon in the past. And therefore, being a bit more independent of America is a really sensible choice just now.
The PM has rejected this suggestion that the UK would have to choose between the US and the EU allies when it came to defence. He's repeated it many times. But Andrew, you write this week that we must behave when it comes to defending Europe as if the US has gone.
I think that is the wise and sensible thing to do. Who knows? I mean, this is such a mercurial president. We don't quite know where he will settle. We have to not listen too much to what he says, but look at what he does. But it is perfectly possible that all those kind of fairly senior figures across Europe, including Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the former Secretary General of NATO, including the new Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, and others who have said the Americans are leaving us, they're going off, and we have to rethink it all. They may be right. Now, either they're right, in which case we need to really rethink defence and do it very, very fast and spend a lot of money, even if we waste bits of it very, very quickly. If for no other reason than to send the right message to Moscow, or if they're wrong, then we're doing something that will encourage a more isolationist, if you like, or less pro-European American government to take us seriously and do the right things for us. Either way, it's a win. It's something that we can't avoid, I'm afraid, I think, at this moment.